The fog came in low across Marsh Hollow County on the morning of the first hard October, and it moved through the apple trees like something that had lived there longer than the trees had. Meredith Thorvald walked at the front of her wagon with the leather lines wrapped once around her right hand and her left hand resting on Judah's warm shoulder. The Percheron's breath came out in slow gray clouds. Beside him, Marlowe lowered her head and pulled quiet and steady, black as riverstone, against the pale grass. The wagon behind them creaked softly under the weight of stacked wooden crates, each one filled with apples still cold from the tree. Ridley moved somewhere ahead of them in the fog, the border collie's small dark shape appearing and disappearing between the rows, low to the ground, nose to the wind. Meredith did not speak. She had learned in the last year that some mornings did not want words in them. She was 42 years old that October. She wore muddy boots and a wool hat pulled low over her ears and a brown canvas jacket her father had bought at a farm supply store in 1996 and worn every fall until the last one he lived through. The jacket still smelled faintly of him, cider and pipe smoke and something like sawdust. She had washed it once early in the spring and had cried in the laundry room when she realized she had washed some of him away with it. She had not washed it since. The oldest tree in the Thorvald orchard stood at the end of the row she was walking through. Her grandfather Bertram had planted it in 1952, the year he came home from Korea, with his hip still full of shrapnel and his mind full of things he never quite told anyone. The tree was older than her father Harlan, older than the barn her father had rebuilt in 1971, older than every fence post on the property. Its trunk had gone gray and knotted, and one lower limb had grown out sideways over the years, low enough that a child could reach up and pick from it without a ladder. She had reached up and picked from it herself once when she was 7 years old. Her father had lifted her onto his shoulders that afternoon. He was not there to lift her anymore. She stopped the horses beside the tree. Judah shifted his weight, the harness clinking softly. Marlowe lowered her head to the grass. Ridley came trotting back from somewhere in the fog and sat down beside Meredith's left boot, panting, watching her with the particular patient attention of a working dog who had figured out over 8 months of steady labor that the human at the end of the line sometimes needed to stop and be still for reasons the dog did not need to understand. Meredith looked up at the old tree. The branches were heavy that morning, fuller than they had been in 6 years, fuller in some places than her father had lived to see them. She stood a long moment, then she reached into her jacket pocket and she pulled out a small folded piece of paper she had carried with her every day since December, and she unfolded it and she read the line she had already read 1,000 times. Let the animals do what machines rush through. She folded it again. She put it back in her pocket. She clicked her tongue softly, and Judah leaned forward and Marlowe followed, and the wagon began to move again through the fog, and the crates behind her creaked with the weight of a harvest she had 1 year earlier almost sold before it ever came. To understand why a 42-year-old accountant from Burlington was walking her grandfather's apple orchard behind 2 draft horses on a fog-heavy Vermont morning, you have to go back. Not to that October, further, all the way back to the November before, when a phone call came at 4:17 on a Tuesday afternoon, and Meredith Thorvald's father Harlan died on the kitchen floor of the farmhouse where he had been born, and where his father Bertram had been born, and where a 40-year-old apple orchard was about to become the last thing anybody Thorvald still owned. Meredith had been sitting at her desk in Burlington when the call came. She had been an accountant at Pemberton Foods for 18 years by then. Rows and columns, quarterly reports, payroll variance analyses, the particular quiet of a life spent making other people's numbers make sense. Her cubicle had a small window that faced east, and every morning at 7:45 she could see the sun clear the top of the parking garage across the street. And she had watched that sun clear that garage for 18 consecutive years without ever once thinking of the sight as either beautiful or sad. The phone had rung. She had picked it up. The voice on the other end had belonged to a paramedic in Marsh Hollow County who had been kind about it in the professional way paramedics learn to be kind. Meredith had put the phone down. She had stood up. She had walked to the office window. She had looked at the sun on the parking garage. She had thought in the flat, orderly way an accountant's mind organizes even the worst news that her father had died at 4:15 in the afternoon of a Tuesday in early November, and that she had been 3 columns deep in the third quarter distribution variance report when he did. 3 days later, she had driven up to the farm. Her brother Colton had flown in from Oregon. He was 38, tall, a mechanical engineer who had left Vermont at 22 and had in the 16 years since come back for exactly 4 Christmases and 2 funerals. He had stood in the farmhouse kitchen the night before their father's service in a black coat that did not fit right anymore, and he had said the thing Meredith had known he was going to say from the moment their father died. "Meredith, we can't keep it." "I know. You have to know we can't keep it." I said, "I know." He had looked at her a long moment. He had said more gently, "We'll get somebody to walk the property, get an appraisal, see what the land is worth. We don't have to decide anything tonight." She had nodded. She had not slept that night. She had lain in her old childhood bed in the room she had grown up in, and she had listened to a house that had gone completely quiet for the first time in her life, and she had understood without quite knowing how to say it, that the silence of a farmhouse the night after its last owner dies is a different silence than any other silence she had ever heard in her life. The consultant walked the property with her the following Tuesday. His name was Wendell Marsh. He was 68 years old, tall and thin, wearing a green Carhartt jacket that had been through 40 Vermont winters and looked ready for 40 more. He had grown fruit in Marsh Hollow County for most of his adult life, and he had been in and out of the Thorvald orchard since Meredith was a girl, drinking coffee on the porch with her father arguing about pruning schedules and rootstock varieties, the particular slow arguments men his age carried on for decades, without either of them ever really needing to win. He walked the rows with her that November morning. He looked at the older trees. He looked at the younger blocks her father had planted in the 1980s. He looked at the compacted soil and the broken fences and the tractor that had not started in 6 months. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he had stopped at the edge of the far block, and he had put his hands in his jacket pockets, and he had said quietly, "Meredith, I liked your father as much as I've ever liked another man. I owe you honesty, and honesty is what I'm going to give you. All right. The practical thing is to take out most of the old block, replant on modern spacing, younger rootstock, trellis system. You'd be looking at 5 to 7 years before it produced real income, and you'd need labor and capital neither of you have. The other option is to sell. There are people who will buy it. It's 40 acres of good North Vermont hillside, and somebody with the right money will make it worth their while." He had looked at the oldest tree at the end of the row, the one her grandfather Bertram had planted in 1952. "You're not saving an orchard, Meredith, not by yourself. You're buying yourself a heartbreak. I'm sorry to say it, but your father would have wanted somebody to say it to you honestly, and I don't see anybody else in this county who's going to." He had left without staying for coffee. Meredith had walked back to the farmhouse alone. She had gone into her father's office. She had pulled his farm ledgers off the shelf where he had kept them for 38 years. She had spread them across the kitchen table, and she had done what she had done every working day of her adult life at Pemberton Foods, which was read numbers other people had written and understand exactly what those numbers were saying. The numbers were saying that Wendell Marsh had been telling her the truth. 3 years of losses, fuel costs up, repair costs up, 2 bad harvests, fruit set declining in the older blocks, labor almost impossible to find at any price the farm could pay. Her father had been running on savings for the last 2 years. There were not many savings left. She had sat at that kitchen table until nearly midnight, and by the time she went to bed, she had understood in the same flat, orderly way she had understood the news of her father's death that the practical thing was to sell. She met with a realtor 2 weeks later. She talked to the bank. She called Colton in Oregon and told him she was going to move ahead. Then 3 days before the meeting that would have made the sale possible on a cold Saturday afternoon in early December with snow falling steady outside the barn windows, Meredith went up to the attic above the barn office looking for a working extension cord her father had told her years ago was up there somewhere. She did not find the extension cord. She found the box. It was cedar, not large. About the size of a shoebox, tucked behind a stack of empty apple crates and a broken picture frame that had held once a photograph of her grandmother taken sometime in the 1960s. The wood had gone dark with age. There was no lock. The lid opened easily under her hand. Inside were her grandfather Bertram's notebooks. 6 of them, small, leather-bound, the covers scuffed and stained with use. She had never seen them before in her life. Her grandfather had died when she was 11, and everything she remembered about him was fragments. his voice low and slow, the particular way old Vermonters spoke when they had lived their entire lives inside the same 20 miles. His hands thick-knuckled from a lifetime of grafting and pruning. The smell of his workshop, which had been half wood shop and half apple storage, and had smelled always like a season that had ended a month before. She had sat down on the cold attic floor with the box open across her lap. She had opened the top notebook. The handwriting was hers before she remembered whose it was. Not her father's handwriting, not her own, her grandfather's. Pencil faded in places to almost nothing, but careful, the particular carefulness of a man who had taught himself to write on a farm ledger in the 1940s and had never once seen the point of writing sloppy. The first page was a weather log from 1963. She read it slowly. She turned the page. Rootstock notes, pollination observations, a hand-drawn map of the orchard as it had existed in 1968 before her father had expanded it with each block labeled in her grandfather's precise pencil script. She kept reading. She read for 2 hours in that cold attic, wrapped in her father's canvas jacket, snow falling steady outside, her breath fogging the pages, and she did not stand up until her legs had gone numb from the cold and she had reached in the middle notebook the passage that would eventually change her life. Let the animals do what machines rush through. She read it 3 times before she trusted what she was seeing. Then she read the pages around it. Her grandfather, Bertram, had used draft horses in this orchard until 1967, not as a hobby, not for show. He had used them because the tractor he could afford in 1953 was too heavy for the soft ground in the low blocks, and because horses could work in tight spaces the tractor could not enter, and because a team of 2 Percherons could pull compost through the orchard without compacting the soil the way a machine would. He had kept bees. 24 hives at the height placed along the sun-facing edge of the property. He had written that a good bloom needed more than good weather. It needed workers, and honeybees were the only workers cheap enough for a small orchard to afford. He had run chickens under the trees for parts of the summer, not many, 60, 70 at the most, in portable enclosures moved every few days. He had written that chickens would eat the fallen fruit before it rotted, would scratch through the leaf litter and disturb the pest cycle, would fertilize the ground in thin natural layers that no machine could match. He had written in a passage she read 4 times that most of the pest problems modern orchards paid enormous amounts of money to control could be prevented cheaply and quietly by 50 chickens paying attention. And he had worked with dogs. Farm dogs, not pets, working partners. He had written that a good farm dog was worth 2 hired hands and could not be talked out of the job by weather or fatigue or a better offer somewhere else. Meredith had sat in that cold attic for another hour reading. She had finally closed the notebook. She had noticed then that there was something else in the box, an envelope. It was tucked beneath the last notebook, sealed with the kind of wax stamp Meredith had only ever seen in old movies, her grandfather's initials pressed into the red wax in a hand-carved seal that had probably belonged to his own father before him. The envelope was slightly yellowed with age. The wax was intact, and across the front of it, in her grandfather's careful pencil script, 6 words had been written, and then sometime in the years afterward underlined heavily in blue pen. The blue ink was newer than the pencil, her father's ink, her father's underlining. Only open when you know what you are doing. She had held the envelope for a long time. She had not opened it. Some part of her had understood without knowing how she understood it that this envelope was not for the version of her sitting in the attic that December afternoon. That version of her still had a meeting with a realtor scheduled for the following Tuesday, and a signed handshake agreement with the bank, and a plan to sell her family's farm because Wendell Marsh had told her kindly that saving it was buying herself a heartbreak. The envelope was for a different version of her. She did not know yet who that version was going to be, but she had known sitting on the cold attic floor with the wax seal warm between her fingers that she was not going to be able to sell this farm on Tuesday, not without at least trying first to become the person the envelope was waiting for. She had carried the box down out of the attic. She had set it on the kitchen table. She had called the realtor that evening and canceled the Tuesday meeting. She had called the bank the next morning and asked for 6 months to explore alternatives. The bank officer, a woman about her age named Talia Renard, had been careful on the phone. "Meredith, I want to be honest with you. 6 months is a lot to ask given the current state of the note, but your father was one of our oldest agricultural clients, and I want to be reasonable. Can I ask what alternatives you're looking at?" "Not yet. I need to look at them first." There had been a pause. All right, 6 months. But Meredith, I want to say something else. Off the record, there is a party that has already expressed interest in your property. I am not going to name them because I have not been given permission to. But I want you to understand that the moment your file becomes distressed, there will be a buyer sitting on our doorstep with a checkbook, so if you find your alternative, find it fast. Meredith had thanked her. She had hung up. She had gone out to the barn office and pulled her grandfather's notebooks off the kitchen table and carried them out to her car, and she had driven back to Burlington that afternoon and had spent the next 6 weeks doing what she had spent 18 years at Pemberton Foods training herself to do. She had read, she had researched, she had done the math. She had visited a small horsepower vegetable farm in upstate New York that used a match team of percherons for row cultivation, and she had spent a Saturday walking their fields with the owner, a woman named Ida Kessler, who was 61 and who had over 3 decades replaced almost every tractor pass on her farm with a horse. She had driven 2 hours south to meet with an old teamster named Rolf Wickham, who still worked with draft horses on a maple sugaring operation, and who had explained to her over 4 hours of coffee and 3 cinnamon rolls exactly what a working draft horse cost per month to feed, shoe harness house, and keep sound. She had called a beekeeper who lived 20 miles from her farm, a man named Ansel Broughton, and she had asked him on the phone whether he would be willing to place 40 hives along the sun-facing edge of the Thorvald orchard in exchange for a share of the honey sales and access to the bloom nectar. Ansel had been quiet for a long moment on the phone. Then he had said in a voice that carried something she did not yet understand, "I would very much like to place hives on your father's land. Yes, very much." She had watched hours of video on chicken pest control in orchards. She had built spreadsheets. She had modeled costs. She had projected feed budgets and labor hours and equipment costs and honey yields and egg production and the compounding effect of soil that got better every year instead of worse. The spreadsheet, when she finished it in mid-February, told her something her father had never let himself believe. The orchard was not too old. The orchard was too rushed. Everything about the way modern apple farming had been done to that land for the last 30 years had been designed for speed. Bigger tractors, faster chemicals, more labor per acre for shorter periods. And the ground had responded to that speed the way ground always responds to being rushed. It had compacted. It had lost organic matter. It had stopped holding water. It had stopped feeding trees. The old system, the one her grandfather Bertram had used until 1967, had not been slower because it was worse. It had been slower because slowness was what the ground needed to stay alive. She had closed the spreadsheet. She had gone to her window in her apartment in Burlington, and she had looked out at the parking lot, and she had understood, without any of the drama she had expected to feel, that she was going to quit her job at Pemberton Foods and go home. She had given notice the following Monday. She had moved back into the farmhouse 2 weeks later. She had spent the last week of February walking the orchard in the cold alone with her grandfather's middle notebook in her jacket pocket, and by the 1st of March she had made every decision she needed to make. She was going to sell her father's utility vehicle. It was the newest piece of equipment on the property, and it would bring $12,000 if she moved it fast. She had savings of her own, some of them, from her mother's small life insurance settlement years earlier, some from the 18 years of quietly building an emergency fund the way an accountant's daughter builds an emergency fund. She had a bank willing to give her 6 months. She had a spreadsheet that showed she could do this. And she had a wax-sealed envelope, still unopened, sitting in the drawer of her grandmother's old writing desk, waiting for the version of her that would eventually earn the right to open it. She had made her first purchase on the 3rd of March. She had driven to a farm outside of Randolph and had come home late that afternoon with a 2-horse trailer clanking behind her pickup and 2 matched percherons standing patient inside it. Judah, 7 years old, dark gray with a white blaze that ran the length of his long, careful face. Marlowe, 6, coal black, slightly smaller, with the particular knowing eye that Rolf Wickham had told her to look for when he had described what a good working mare looked like at a working age. She had backed the trailer into the barnyard. She had opened the trailer gate. The 2 horses had stepped down onto the frozen ground of the Thorvald orchard for the first time in 57 years. Judah had lowered his head to sniff at the barn wall. Marlowe had lifted her nose to the wind, and had, without any signal from Meredith at all, turned her ears forward toward the old apple tree at the end of the row her grandfather Bertram had planted in 1952, as if she had been recognizing something. Meredith had stood at the barn door watching them a long moment. She had not been able in that moment to say aloud what she was feeling. She was not a woman who said things aloud when nobody else was there to hear them. But she had understood, standing at that barn door in the cold March wind, that a piece of her family had just come home to a farm that had been waiting almost 60 years for it. The dog had come 3 days later. He was a 2-year-old border collie tricolor from a rescue in southern New Hampshire that specialized in working breeds that had been given up on by suburban owners. His original name had been something Meredith had decided not to keep. She had renamed him Ridley after a road her grandfather had once walked in the woods on the far side of the property, and the name had settled onto him almost instantly, the way good names do. He had spent his first hour on the farm in a state of quiet, focused observation. He had walked the perimeter of the barnyard. He had looked at Judah. He had looked at Marlowe. He had looked at Meredith. He had sat down beside her boot, and he had waited with the particular attention of an animal who had been bred for 200 years to figure out what needed doing and then to do it. And Meredith had understood, standing there in the cold, that she was not looking at a pet. She was looking at an employee. The chickens had come next. 60 birds, hardy and active, mostly Buckeyes and Wyandottes, because Rolf Wickham had told her those breeds handled Vermont cold and had strong scratching instincts. They had arrived in cardboard shipping crates on a Wednesday afternoon in mid-March, and Meredith had spent 2 days building portable fencing and small mobile shelters, and by the following Monday, the birds were rotating through the first section of orchard floor she had marked out on her map. The bees had come last. Ansel Broughton had driven up on a cool morning at the end of March with 16 hives on the back of his flatbed and instructions to bring more the following week. He was 63 years old, thin, with silver hair and a beard that had not been trimmed carefully in years, and hands that carried the small, unmistakable scars of a man who had been working bees since he was 12. He had unloaded the hives one at a time, slowly, carefully, along the south-facing fence line where the afternoon sun caught the ridge and warmed the ground earlier in the spring than anywhere else on the property. He had not spoken much while he worked. Meredith had helped him where she could and had stayed out of his way where she could not, and had watched him place the last hive of that first delivery with the particular care of a man who was not just delivering equipment, but placing something living into ground he seemed somehow to already know. She had asked him when they had finished whether he wanted to come up to the farmhouse for coffee. He had looked at her a long moment. He had looked out across the orchard at Judah and Marlowe grazing in the far pasture, at the chickens moving in their portable enclosure at Ridley, sitting attentive on the barn ramp, watching all of it at once. He had said quietly, "Yes, Meredith, I would like that very much." They had sat at the kitchen table together for the better part of an hour. He had told her slowly that he had known her father Harlan for almost 40 years, that he had known her grandfather Bertram slightly in the last years of Bertram's life from a Farm Bureau meeting in 1979, where the two of them had ended up talking about honey for the better part of an evening. He had told her more slowly that he had run his own apple orchard once, 15 miles east of here over the ridge, not large, 14 acres. He had run it for 22 years with his wife Ilsa before she passed, and he had run it for 4 more years after that. And then something had happened to his bees that had ended his orchard and had, in a real sense, ended the working life he had spent his adult years building. He had not said what the something was. He had only said that he had been out of the orchard business for almost 15 years now, and that he kept bees on other people's land these days, and that he had, when Meredith had called him in January, understood immediately that placing hives on Thorvald ground was something he had been quietly hoping to do for a very long time, though he had not, until she called, understood that he had been hoping for it. Meredith had not pushed him. She had refilled his coffee. She had let the story sit where it was at the edge of the table between them, and she had understood that Ansel Broughton was carrying something he was not yet ready to say, and that whatever it was, it belonged to him to say when he chose to. He had left that afternoon with a promise to bring the remaining hives the following week. Meredith had stood on the porch and watched his flatbed go down the driveway, and she had felt for the first time since her father died that the farm around her had begun to breathe in a rhythm she recognized. Then, on the 7th of March, Garrison Vale had knocked on her front door. She had not been expecting him. He was 55 years old, Tall, well-dressed in the particular way of men who owned large operations and wanted the people they met to notice within 30 seconds that they did. He wore a dark green wool coat and boots that had never seen mud, and he stood on the porch of the Thorvald farmhouse, smiling warmly in a way that Meredith had understood inside of 3 seconds she did not entirely trust. Miss Thorvald, Garrison Vale. I own Vale Orchards, your neighbor to the east. I wanted to come by and offer condolences for your father. Thank you. He was a good man. I did not know him well, but I respected him from a distance. I wonder if I could take a moment of your time. She had let him in. He had sat at her kitchen table at the same seat where Ansel Broughton had sat 3 days earlier, and he had come to the point faster than Meredith had expected. I understand you have some decisions to make about the property. I want to make one of those decisions easier for you. I am prepared to offer 15% above current appraised value for the entire parcel. Cash, 30-day close, no inspection contingencies. I would give you full title to the farmhouse and the acre it sits on if you wanted to keep the house. You could stay in your father's home. You could sell me the orchard, retain the residence, walk away with a significant amount of capital and no further obligation. Meredith had not answered right away. She had looked at him. She had understood watching his face that Garrison Vale had rehearsed this speech, that he had delivered it to grieving landowners before. That the language of it, the particular careful phrases about staying in your father's home and walking away clean, had been worked out over years by a man who had bought a lot of land from a lot of people who had not at first wanted to sell it. Mr. Vale. Please, Garrison. Mr. Vale, I appreciate the offer. I am not able to give you an answer today. The smile had not left his face, but something behind it had shifted very briefly in a way she noticed because she had spent 18 years reading the faces of executives at Pemberton Foods. Of course. Take whatever time you need. I do want to say, Miss Thorvald, that the offer has an expiration. I would like your response within 30 days. After that, I cannot guarantee the price. I understand. He had stood. At the door, he had paused. He had looked out at the barnyard where Ridley was sitting on the ramp watching a delivery truck turn around in the driveway, and where a cardboard chick shipping crate still sat empty on the porch. You have some interesting purchases here, Miss Thorvald. I do. I do hope you are not planning to try to run this operation yourself. It is a significant undertaking. Your father struggled with it. Your grandfather worked hard for what he had. I am aware of what my family worked for, Mr. Vale. He had held her eyes a moment longer. Then he had smiled again warmly, and he had said, 30 days, Miss Thorvald. He had walked to his truck. He had driven away. Meredith had stood on the porch for a long time after he left. The wind moved through the orchard. Judah lifted his head from the far pasture and looked toward the house. Ridley came to the porch and sat down beside her boot without being asked. She thought about her grandfather's notebook, about the passage in the middle, about the sealed envelope in the drawer of her grandmother's writing desk. She thought about Ansel Broughton, whose hives were already sitting along her south fence line, and who had told her at her kitchen table that something had happened to his bees 15 years ago and had not yet told her what. She thought about Garrison Vale's smile and the smoothness of the language he had used, and the way he had looked at her chickens like a man appraising something he had not yet decided to want. She went inside. She called Talia Rennert at the bank. Talia, it's Meredith Thorvald. Meredith, everything all right? Garrison Vale came to my house today with an offer. There had been a long pause on the line. Meredith had heard in that pause the sound of a woman making a decision. Meredith, there is something I probably should not tell you, but I am going to tell you because I have known your family for a long time and because I do not believe Garrison Vale came to your house without knowing what he was doing when he did it. What is it? He has been asking about your note. He has offered to purchase it from us if your account becomes distressed. I have not agreed. I do not intend to agree, but I need you to understand what you are dealing with, Meredith. Garrison Vale does not want your land. He wants the price of your land after you have run out of options. Meredith had gone very quiet. She had thanked Talia. She had hung up. She had walked back out onto the porch. The March sun was still weak, but it was falling on the shoulders of Judah and Marlowe in the far pasture, and it was lighting the tops of the apple trees, and Ridley was sitting attentive on the barn ramp watching the road. and inside her jacket pocket the folded piece of paper her grandfather had written 70 years earlier said what it had said since she found it in the attic on a cold December afternoon: let the animals do what machines rush through. She looked out across her father's orchard. She looked at the oldest tree at the end of the row her grandfather had planted in 1952. She said out loud to nobody who could hear her, "Not this land, not this one." Somewhere in the sun-warmed grass along the fence line, Ansel Broughton's bees were beginning for the first time since her father's death to move out of their hives. The wax-sealed envelope sat in the drawer of her grandmother's writing desk, still unopened, still waiting for the version of her that had not yet arrived and would not arrive. She understood now, until she had earned it. The phone rang inside the house, Colton calling from Oregon. She did not answer. She stood on the porch a long moment longer, and the wind came up through the orchard, and Ridley lifted his head, and Meredith Thorvald, 42 years old, 18 years an accountant, and 8 days a farmer, understood that whatever was coming for her over the next 12 months was already on its way. She was not ready for it. She was going to have to become ready for it. She went inside. She picked up the phone. She called her brother back. "Colton, Meredith, I got your voicemail from last week about the horses. I bought them." There had been a long silence on the line. "Meredith, are you out of your mind?" "I am not out of my mind, Colton. I am going to save Dad's orchard." "With horses." "With horses and bees and chickens and a dog and Grandpa Bertram's notebooks, which I found in the attic in December and which I have been reading for 3 months and which are telling me exactly what this farm needs. And I am telling you now so you know that I have declined an offer from a man named Garrison Vale who tried to buy the property this afternoon. And I am going to keep declining offers from him until I run this operation into the ground trying, or until the harvest comes in and proves me right." Another silence. Then Colton had said more quietly, "Meredith, are you sure? Really sure?" "No, Colton, I am not sure. I have never been less sure of anything in my life, but I am doing it anyway, and I would like you to be my brother while I do it." He had not answered right away. When he had, his voice had been different than it had been in every conversation the two of them had had since their father died. "All right, Meredith, all right. I am your brother." She had thanked him. She had hung up. She had gone out to the barn. Judah had lifted his head from his hay when she came in. Marlowe had turned her long black neck to watch her. Ridley had already been at her heels. She had leaned her forehead against Judah's warm gray shoulder in the quiet of the barn, in the dust and the hay smell and the low late afternoon light, and she had stayed there a long moment without moving. 12 months. 12 months to prove that her grandfather had been right. 12 months to prove that the ground her father had died on could still, at 40 acres and 80 years old, and 3 seasons of losses deep, come back to life if somebody was patient enough to let it. 12 months to earn the right to open the envelope in the drawer of her grandmother's writing desk. She lifted her head from Judah's shoulder. She walked out of the barn. The March sun was going down behind the ridge, and the sky above the orchard had gone pink and gold, and somewhere in the far pasture Marlowe had begun quietly to graze. And the first honey bees of the spring were still moving in the sun-warmed grass along the fence line, and Ridley walked at Meredith Thorvald's heel as she went back up to the farmhouse to make her first supper as a woman who had that afternoon finally chosen who she was going to be. The first month on the Thorvald farm taught Meredith exactly how little she had understood about the animals she had brought onto her family's land. Judah refused on the 3rd morning of March to walk through a narrow section between the older apple rows because a piece of black plastic had come loose from the fence line and was flapping in the wind. Meredith had stood in the cold mud with the leather lines in her hands and had for a full 10 minutes tried every technique Rolf Wickham had described to her over coffee back in January. She had spoken low. She had turned Judah in a slow half-circle. She had let him approach and back off and approach again. The gray Percheron had planted his enormous hooves and had watched that piece of plastic with the particular attentiveness of a horse who had at 7 years old seen every version of every trick a human being had ever tried on him, and had decided with the deep, patient certainty of his breed that no woman with cold hands was going to talk him past a flapping thing he did not trust. Meredith had finally walked over to the fence, untied the plastic, and stuffed it into her coat pocket. Judah had walked forward without a word from her. Marlowe the black mare had watched this from the near side of the harness with what Meredith had come in the weeks since to recognize as amusement. That had been the third morning. On the fifth morning, Marlowe had figured out how to lean her considerable weight against the gate of the barnyard paddock until the latch popped open and she had walked calmly out into the far pasture at 4:30 in the morning to eat clover. Meredith had woken to Ridley's low growling at the bedroom window, had gone out in her nightgown and her father's canvas jacket and boots with no socks, and had spent 40 minutes in the dark leading a 900-pound draft mare back through wet grass by the leather cheek strap of a halter she had barely known how to put on a week earlier. On the eighth morning, Ridley had lost his mind. The chickens had been in their portable enclosure for 4 days by then, and a section of orchard Meredith had marked out on her map for pest cycle interruption. The border collie had watched them at first with the quiet, focused attention of a working dog studying a job he did not yet understand. Then on the eighth morning, a mockingbird had flown low across the enclosure, and Ridley had, for reasons Meredith would spend the next hour trying to reconstruct, decided that the mockingbird was his responsibility, and that the chickens were an acceptable path to reach it. He had gone through the electric netting like it wasn't there. The chickens had scattered, not slowly, not partially, 60 birds in every direction at once, into the raspberry brambles that ran along the east side of the orchard, into the tall grass under the older trees over the low field stone wall her grandfather had built in 1959. Meredith had stood in the middle of the empty enclosure with her coffee mug still steaming in her hand and had understood with the flat clarity of a woman whose entire spring plan had just in 90 seconds undone itself that she had approximately 6 hours of daylight to get 60 chickens back inside a fence before the coyotes woke up. She had spent that day on her hands and knees crawling under low-hanging apple branches, calling to birds that had no reason to come to her, coaxing hens out of raspberry canes that had drawn thin, bloody lines across every bare inch of her arms. Ridley had been shut in the barn since the moment of the breakout. He had watched her through the barn window with an expression Meredith could not quite read. By dusk, she had recovered 54 chickens. The other 6 were, as far as she knew, still out somewhere in the brush. She had gone back to the farmhouse in the last light with her hands scratched raw, her boots caked with mud, her back locked up in the particular way a back locks up when a woman past 40 has spent 9 hours crouched under fruit trees. And she had sat down at the kitchen table without taking her boots off, and had, for the first time since her father died, put her head in her hands and cried until she could not cry anymore. The phone had rung during that. She had let it go. When she had finally raised her head 40 minutes later, she had checked the voicemail. It had been Colton from Oregon. "Meredith, it's your brother. Just checking in. Call me when you get a chance. I love you." Nothing else. No questioning. No pressure. No suggestion for the first time she could remember that she reconsider what she was doing. She had listened to that voicemail twice. Then she had gone out to the barn and had let Ridley out, and the border collie had come to her without lifting his head low to the ground, the particular submissive walk of a working dog who understood that he had failed at his job, and she had crouched in the barn aisle and had put her forehead against his forehead, and she had said very quietly, "We are going to figure this out. Both of us. All right." Ridley had licked her hand once and had lain down at her feet. The next morning, Meredith had started training him from the beginning. Not with the chickens, with herself. She had walked the barnyard for 2 hours back and forth, teaching him the 4 cues Ralph Wickham had told her to teach first. Come by, away to me. Steady, that'll do. She had felt ridiculous. She had done it anyway. And by the end of that first day of proper training, Ridley had begun to move his body in the small, deliberate ways of a border collie who was starting to remember what he had been bred across 200 years to do. They worked on the empty chicken enclosure for a full week before Meredith led him near the actual birds again. She had understood by the end of that first month that she was not training Ridley. Ridley had been trained by 200 years of border collie breeding before she had ever met him. She was training herself to be a person Ridley could work for. The bees had been a different kind of crisis. Ansel Broughton had brought the second load of hives on the 22nd of March, bringing the total to 40. He had placed them along the sun-facing fence line with the same patient precision he had used for the first 16. He had stayed for coffee that afternoon, and Meredith had asked him carefully what she should expect from the bees in the first 6 weeks. Weather, Ansel had said. That's it. Weather. Not much else. If April comes in warm and stays warm, we'll have strong colonies by bloom. If April comes in cold and stays cold, we'll lose some. There is no version of beekeeping in which a person can hurry a colony that the weather has decided not to warm. Is there something I can do? You can leave them alone. You can let them out of the hive when they are ready to come out of the hive. You cannot open the boxes to check on them because every time you open a box in April, you lose heat. And heat in April is the difference between a strong colony and a dead one. He had paused. He had said more quietly, Meredith, bees don't work on human schedules. That is the first thing I ever learned, and it is the last thing I am still learning. You can love a colony, you can build a colony, a beautiful hive. You can place it in the perfect spot, in the perfect apiary, in the most fertile bloom in the county. And if the weather goes wrong, you will lose it, and there is nothing you can do about it except learn to accept that a beekeeper is not somebody who controls bees. A beekeeper is somebody who arranges the world so that bees have a slightly better chance. She had thought about that for a long time after he left. She had understood in a way she had not understood before why an accountant's spreadsheet was not going to be enough. Not for this. Then on the 11th of April, the cold snap had come. The weather forecast had called for 2 nights of freezing temperatures. Meredith had watched the sky the entire day. By sunset, the temperature had already dropped to 29 degrees, and the wind had been coming out of the north hard enough to bend the tops of the sugar maples on the ridge. She had called Ansel that evening. Meredith, I know. What do we do? There is nothing to do. The bees know what to do. They will cluster. They will keep the queen warm. They will burn through their stores. In the morning, we will find out which colonies were strong enough to make it and which ones were not. The cold had held for 4 days. On the 5th day, Ansel had driven out to inspect the hives. Meredith had stood a respectful distance behind him while he worked. He had moved through the apiary, slowly opening lids, listening occasionally, reaching in with the practiced hand of a man who had done this for 51 years. He had made small, quiet sounds at some of the hives. He had gone longer at others in silence. He had stopped at the 5th hive from the fence corner. He had not opened it. He had listened for a long moment. Then he had closed his eyes. He had moved down the line. By the time he reached the last hive, he had opened his notebook, and Meredith had understood from the number of small, dark tick marks he had made on the page that they had not come through the cold intact. He had walked back to her slowly. 5 gone. Ansel. 5 out of 40. Not the worst it could have been. Not by a long way. But 5 colonies that will not pollinate your bloom this year, Meredith. 5 colonies I placed on your land 3 weeks ago that are gone. Is there anything we can do? I can bring in 3 replacements. That is the best I can offer. 3, not 5. The strongest colonies I have. They will not be as strong as the ones we lost, but they will be alive and they will work as much of your bloom as they can. Meredith had stood in the cold April wind looking at the hives and had understood that this was the first real loss. She had thanked Ansel. She had gone back to the farmhouse. She had sat at the kitchen table for a long time. She had done what she always did when she did not know what else to do. She had opened her grandfather's middle notebook, and she had read the passage she had already read 100 times, and she had tried to hear her grandfather Bertram's voice in it. Let the animals do what machines rush through. She had understood that afternoon in a way she had not understood before, that the animals were also going to die. That was the part of the passage her grandfather had not written down, because he had not needed to write it down, because anybody who had ever kept a living thing already knew. She had sat at the kitchen table until the light in the window went gold, and then she had gone out to the barn, and she had put a hand on Judah's warm gray shoulder, and she had leaned her forehead against him for a long time without saying anything. That was the first false defeat. The second one had come a month later and had been worse. Corbin had arrived on a warm Thursday in the middle of May, delivered by Colton at Burlington Airport on a flight from Portland. The boy was 14 years old, tall for his age, dark-haired with his mother's eyes and his father's stubborn mouth. He had not, when Colton had first proposed the visit in April, wanted to come. He had wanted to spend his summer with his friends in Oregon. He had wanted in the particular flat way of a 14-year-old who was being asked to do something he had not chosen, absolutely no part of a Vermont apple orchard. Colton had put him on the plane anyway. He had told Meredith on the phone the night before that he did not know what else to do. His grades slipped this year, Meredith. He's been sullen. He's been on his phone constantly. I do not know what I'm doing wrong with him. He was different before his mother's cancer scare last summer. Something got knocked loose in him, and I have not been able to figure out how to put it back. You want me to try? I want somebody to try, Meredith. I am running out of ideas. Meredith had picked Corbin up at the airport on a Thursday afternoon. The boy had barely spoken on the drive up to Marsh Hollow. He had looked out the passenger window. He had answered her questions in monosyllables. He had, when she had pulled up in front of the farmhouse, unloaded his own duffel bag, and had walked into the house behind her without any of the small, pleasant conversation a boy his age might once have offered. She had shown him his room. She had let him alone. She had gone out to the barn that afternoon to give the horses their evening hay. She had not expected the boy to come with her. He had come with her. He had stood in the barn doorway with his hands in his pockets, watching her feed Judah and Marlowe, saying nothing. She had not asked him anything. She had just done her work. After a while, without a word, he had picked up a pitchfork. He had helped her without being asked. She had thanked him at the end. He had shrugged. That had been the first day. Over the next 2 weeks, without her ever quite noticing when it began, Corbin had become quietly a fixture in the orchard's daily life. He had taken to Ridley immediately, and Ridley had taken to him. The two of them had worked out a routine together, moving the chickens between rotation sections at 7 in the morning and again at 5 in the evening, and Meredith had come to understand watching them that a 14-year-old boy and a 2-year-old working border collie had figured out something between them that she herself had spent 2 months struggling to learn. Corbin had been sullen at breakfast. He had been quiet at supper, but out in the orchard in the mornings and evenings, moving chickens with a rescue dog through his great-grandfather's apple trees. The boy had looked for the first time since he had arrived, like a person who was doing something that mattered. Then on the 23rd of May, the second false defeat had come. Meredith had gone out at first light to bring the horses in for their morning work. Judah had not come to her. She had called him. He had not lifted his head from where he was standing at the corner of the pasture near the low field stone wall. She had walked out to him across the wet grass. She had put her hand on his shoulder. She had run her hand down his front leg the way Rolf Wickham had taught her to check for heat. His left front pastern had been hot to the touch. There had been swelling above the hoof. Meredith had lifted the hoof and had looked at it, and she had seen in the soft V of the frog the head of a nail, not a horseshoe nail, a roofing nail, rust-flecked, fresh enough that it had not yet set into the tissue. She had stood in the wet grass for a long moment with Judah's enormous foot cradled in her hand. She had understood, without letting herself understand it yet, exactly what she was looking at. She had called the veterinarian. Dr. Priscilla Wardlaw had driven out inside of 90 minutes. She was a horse vet in her late 50s, brisk, practical, with the particular gentleness a good large animal vet develops over decades. She had examined Judah's foot carefully. She had removed the nail. She had cleaned the puncture wound, packed it, wrapped the hoof. She had straightened up. She had looked at Meredith. That nail did not fall into your pasture, Meredith. I know. That nail was placed. I know. I can tell you a few things. I can tell you that the nail was pushed in point first, which is not consistent with a horse stepping on a nail lying flat on the ground. I can tell you the head of the nail was still clean, which means it had not been out there long enough to weather. And I can tell you that whoever did this knew enough about horses to place it in a spot where a large draft would put full weight on it if he happened to graze there. Meredith had said nothing. Meredith, do you want to call the sheriff? Not yet. Meredith. Not yet, Priscilla. I need to think. Dr. Wardlaw had looked at her a long moment. She had said more gently, 6 weeks minimum before he can work again. Longer if the wound abscesses. He needs to be kept on soft bedding, cleaned twice a day, and watched. He should be fine long term. But your spring work is going to have to happen with one horse, not two. She had left. Meredith had stood in the barn aisle with Judah's swollen leg wrapped in cotton and vet tape, and she had let herself for the first time since December feel afraid. Not sad, not tired, afraid, because whoever had put that nail in her pasture had known what they were doing, and whoever had put that nail in her pasture had access to her land. And whoever had put that nail in her pasture had wanted more than anything for her to lose her ability to work through the spring. She had thought about Garrison Vale. She had not been able to prove anything. She had spent the next 3 days walking her fence line personally, section by section, looking for anything else that had been placed. She had found nothing. She had, on the 3rd day, extended her fence line inspection out into the section that ran along Vale Orchards' western boundary, and she had noticed standing there in the warm May sun that a section of her own fencing had been quietly and carefully cut and then reset in a way she would not have noticed if she had not been looking. She had photographed it. She had said nothing to anybody. She had called Colton that night and had told him about the nail. He had gone quiet on the phone for a long time. Then he had said, "Meredith, do you want me to fly out?" "No." "Meredith." "Colton, listen to me. I do not want you to fly out. What I want is for Corbin to stay for the whole summer. I know that is not what we agreed. I know you said 4 weeks. I need him longer. He is a good worker. He is good with the dog. He is good with the chickens. I need him here. And I need you to trust me, Colton, because something is happening on this farm that I do not entirely understand yet, and I would rather have your son with me while I figure it out than have him back in Portland wondering if his aunt is losing her mind." Colton had thought about that for a long time. "All right," he had said. "He can stay through Labor Day if he wants to. I'll ask him." "Meredith, do not lie to me. If it gets dangerous, you tell me." "I will." She had asked Corbin the following morning. The boy had, for the first time since he had arrived, looked at her with real interest. "You need me here. I need you here. Not because Dad's making me stay. Not because your dad is making you stay. Because I am asking you to." Corbin had looked out the kitchen window at Judah standing in the barn paddock with his wrapped hoof at Marlowe beside him at Ridley on the porch, waiting to go out. "Okay," he had said. That was all. But when he had gone out to move the chickens that afternoon, Meredith had watched him from the kitchen window and had seen him walk differently across her father's orchard than he had walked in his first 2 weeks. Not sullen, not aimless, purposeful. The particular purposeful walk of a boy who had figured out for the first time in the year since his mother's cancer scare that somebody was counting on him for something that actually mattered. She had called Ansel Broughton that evening. She had told him about the nail. Ansel had been quiet for a very long time on the phone. When he had finally spoken, his voice had carried a weight Meredith had not heard from him before. "Meredith, I need to come see you." "When?" "Tomorrow." He had come the following morning. They had sat together at the kitchen table, the same one where Ansel had told her back in March about his own orchard 15 miles east, and about the something that had happened to his bees 15 years earlier that he had not then been ready to name. He had been ready that morning. "Meredith, I need to tell you what happened to my orchard." "All right." He had put his coffee cup down. "In 2009, my apiary lost 34 of 38 hives in the space of 6 weeks, not to winter, not to weather, to pesticide drift. Systemic, neurotoxic pesticides. My colonies were healthy going into that spring. They were dead by June. I lost the majority of my bees, and without the bees, the majority of my apple bloom, and without the bloom, the majority of that year's crop. The following year, the losses continued. I could not afford to run the orchard. I sold to the bank for what I owed on it, which was less than what I had put into it, and I have not owned an orchard since." Meredith had sat very still. "Ansel, who did the pesticide drift come from?" He had looked at her a long moment. "The wind came out of the east that spring, Meredith. It came out of the east for 6 straight weeks. To the east of my orchard was and still is the operation now known as Vale Orchards." Meredith had not said anything. "I could never prove it. I tried. I hired a lawyer. I filed a complaint with the state agricultural department. Nothing came of it. The application records showed nothing outside of approved use. The wind patterns were plausible but not conclusive. And Garrison Vale had by then built the kind of relationships with the county and the state that made it very difficult for a small beekeeper with dying colonies to be heard by anyone with the authority to help him." Meredith had thought about the nail in Judah's hoof, about the cut fence, about Garrison Vale's smile in her kitchen. "Ansel, why did you agree to put your hives on my land?" He had looked out the kitchen window for a long moment, at the apple trees in bloom, at the sun on the ridge, at the chickens moving through the orchard in the mid-morning light. "Because your grandfather, Bertram, was one of the only farmers in this county who understood what I lost when I lost my bees. He came to my house the summer of 2009. He drove out unannounced. He sat with me on my porch. He told me that whatever had happened to my colonies had happened because we live in a world that has forgotten how to farm slowly, and that if I ever wanted to work bees again on land that would not kill them, I should call him. Did you call him?" "He died the next year, Meredith, before I was ready." Ansel had not said anything else for a long moment. "When you called me in January," he had said finally, "I understood that Bertram had sent me a second chance from a place I did not think second chances came from. I said yes because there was no other answer I could have given. That is the whole of it. That is the reason my hives are on your land." He had looked at her. And now Garrison Vale is placing nails in your pasture, and now you have a dog and a boy and a mare who is working alone because her partner cannot bear weight. And now, Meredith, I am going to tell you the same thing your grandfather told me on that porch in 2009 because it is the only thing anybody ever needs to know when this kind of man decides to come for their land. He had leaned forward. You do not have to prove anything to him. You have to prove it to your ground. And your ground already believes you. That is why the bees are working. That is why the horses are pulling. That is why the chickens are laying and the dog is running. And your grandfather's oldest tree has the fullest fruit set it has had in 12 years. Vale can put nails in your pasture. He cannot put nails in the soil under your trees. And the soil under your trees is what will decide this. He had left that afternoon. Meredith had walked out to the barn. She had spent that evening sitting on an overturned bucket beside Judah's stall, changing his hoof wrap by the light of a single bulb, and had felt for the first time since she had found the nail, something in her settle, into a shape she recognized. The next morning, Emmett Wexley had come up the driveway. He was 71 that year. He had grown fruit in Marsh Hollow County for 49 seasons. He had been the man back in November who had walked her orchard with Wendell Marsh's practical eye and had later that same week told her at a diner in town that she was buying herself a heartbreak. She had not spoken to him in 5 months. She had assumed in the way one assumes about older men who have already made their opinions known that she would not speak to him again. He had parked his truck, he had climbed out, he had walked over to where Meredith was standing at the paddock rail watching Marlowe graze alone. He had leaned on the rail beside her. He had not said anything for a long moment. Then he had said quietly, "I heard about your horse." "How did you hear?" "Priscilla Wardlaw is my cousin's daughter. She did not tell me what happened. She only told me that I might want to come by." Meredith had waited. "Meredith, I have a Percheron gelding named Wit at my place, 15 years old. I have not worked him hard in 3 years. He is broken to harness. He is quiet under lines. He is the same size as your mare, and he is sitting in my pasture eating hay. He does not need to eat. I would like you to take him for 6 weeks, until your gray comes back sound. No charge, no arrangement, neighbor to neighbor." Meredith had not been able to speak for a moment. "Emmett, I know what I said to you in November, Meredith. I want you to know I remember every word of it. I said it because I believed it. I still believe most of it. But I have driven past this orchard 14 times since March, and I have watched what you were trying to do, and I owe you the honesty of saying that I underestimated you. Your father was my friend. Your grandfather was my father's friend. I would not be a good neighbor if I let you work a horse-drawn orchard with one horse when I have a second one sitting in a field doing nothing." Meredith had held her hand out. Emmett Wexley had taken it. He had held her hand a moment longer than a handshake needed to be held. "I will bring him over tomorrow," he had said. He had walked back to his truck. He had driven away. Meredith had stood at the paddock rail for a long time after he had gone. Marlowe had come over to the rail eventually and had lowered her enormous black head against Meredith's shoulder, and the two of them had stood there in the warm May sun without moving, and Meredith had understood, in a way she had not understood a week earlier, that she was not doing this alone anymore. The bloom had come 3 days later. The apple trees in the Thorvald orchard, all 40 acres of them, had opened at once on a warm afternoon in the last week of May, and the sound of the bees moving through the blossoms had been for the first time since Meredith had been a girl, a sound that had filled the entire property. Meredith had walked the rows at first light the following morning. She had gone to her grandfather's oldest tree first, the one at the end of the row he had planted in 1952. She had stood beneath it. She had looked up into the pink and white blossoms. She had listened. The bees had been working it steadily. She had put her hand on the trunk. She had thought about her grandfather Bertram, whom she had known only as an old man, whom she had never seen work this orchard with the horses he had described in his notebooks, whom she had, until that December afternoon in the barn attic, understood only through the shape of a life he had already been finishing when she was born. She had thought about the sealed envelope in the drawer of her grandmother's writing desk. She had understood, standing under that tree, that she was not yet ready to open it, but she had also understood that she was closer than she had been in December. Corbin had come out to find her later that morning. He had walked up the road toward her, with Ridley at his heel, the boy 14 years old, tall for his age, his dark hair pushed back under a farm cap that had belonged to her father, wearing his great-grandfather's canvas work apron he had found in the barn and had taken to wearing every day. He had stopped in front of her. "Aunt Meredith?" "Yes." I got a letter from Dad this morning. He wants to know if I can stay through November. She had looked at him. He does. He said you asked him for the summer, but I told him I want to stay longer, through harvest, if you'll have me. She had put her hand on the back of his neck. She had not said anything. Corbin had leaned into her hand briefly in the particular way of a boy who was not yet a man but was no longer a child, and then he had straightened up and had gone back to work walking down the row with Ridley at his heel into the pink and white bloom of an orchard that had that morning finally begun to look like the place it was supposed to be. The sheriff's deputy had come to the farmhouse the following Tuesday. Meredith had called them 2 days after Emmett had brought Whit over once she had decided that she was going to. The deputy was a man in his mid-40s named Dwayne Bristol. He had grown up in Marsh Hollow. He had known her father. He had walked the property with her that afternoon, and she had shown him the cut fence, and she had shown him where Judah had been standing when he stepped on the nail, and she had shown him the photographs she had taken. He had listened. He had taken notes. At the end, he had said, "Meredith, off the record, I cannot arrest anybody based on this evidence. You know I cannot. What I can do is file a report, and I can drive by your property twice a week for the next month. And I can, if you'd like, mention to certain of your neighbors that this file is now open at the sheriff's department. That last one is worth more than the first two. Mention it to Garrison Vale." Dwayne Bristol had looked at her a long moment. He had said quietly, "I will mention it to Garrison Vale, Meredith. I will mention it to him myself." He had left. 2 weeks later, the summons had arrived. It had come in a plain manila envelope delivered by certified mail on the 14th of July, and it had been signed by an attorney out of Montpelier, whose name Meredith did not recognize. The document inside had been a civil complaint. Vale Orchards, LLC versus Meredith Thorvald, doing business as Thorvald Orchard. The complaint had alleged that the honeybees operated by Ansel Broughton on Thorvald property had been crossing the fence line into Vale Orchards in numbers sufficient to constitute a nuisance, and that Vale Orchards had suffered financial harm as a result of said bees interfering with routine spraying operations, contaminating fruit intended for a specific market, and causing hive-related disturbances to Vale Orchards employees. The complaint had requested that all 40 hives be removed from Thorvald Orchard within 30 days. It had scheduled a hearing before the county court on the 3rd Tuesday of September. Meredith had read it once. She had read it again. She had put it down on the kitchen table, and she had stood at the window looking out at the orchard, at the bees moving in the summer light through the blossoms that had 6 weeks earlier begun the pollination that would decide the harvest, and she had understood exactly what Garrison Vale was doing. He was not trying to win the lawsuit. He was trying to make her spend money defending it. She had called Ansel that evening. She had told him. He had been quiet for a long time on the phone. Then he had said in a voice she had not heard from him before, "Meredith, I need to see you tomorrow. There is something I have been holding back. It is time I told you." She had hung up. She had gone into her grandmother's writing room. She had opened the drawer of the old writing desk. She had taken out the sealed envelope her grandfather had left in the cedar box in the attic, the one marked in his careful pencil script and underlined heavily in her father's blue pen. "Only open when you know what you are doing." She had held the envelope in her hands for a long moment. She had put it back in the drawer. She had closed the drawer. Not yet. She was not ready yet. But she understood standing there in the quiet of her grandmother's writing room in the warm July evening, closer than she had ever been. Outside in the last light, Corbin had been moving the chickens with Ridley and Marlowe, and Whit had been standing side by side at the pasture rail watching him work. And Judah had been sound enough by then to bear his own weight in his stall, and Ansel Bruton's bees, 38 strong, now that the 3 replacements had settled in, had been coming back to the hives for the evening in the long, slow way. Bees come back to a good apiary at the end of a good day. Somewhere over the ridge in an orchard 15 miles east that Garrison Vale now owned but had not built, Ansel Bruton was writing down on a legal pad by his kitchen table everything he had been holding back for 15 years. The story he was going to tell her tomorrow was going to change everything. Meredith Thorvald did not know that yet, but she was going to know it by the end of the week. Ansel Broughton arrived at the Thorvald farmhouse at 9 the next morning with a manila folder on the passenger seat of his truck and a look on his face Meredith had not seen from him in the 5 months since he had first placed a hive along her south fence line. She had already put the coffee on. She had heard his truck coming up the drive from a quarter-mile away, and she had known from the sound of him downshifting at the mailbox instead of at the turn that he was carrying something heavier than usual. He'd come up onto the porch. He had taken his cap off. He had held the manila folder against his chest with both hands, the way a man holds something he has been carrying for years and does not entirely know how to set down. She had opened the door. "Come in, Ansel." He had followed her into the kitchen. He had sat down at the same seat he had sat in back in March and again in May, when he had told her about his own orchard and about the something that had happened to his bees. He had put the manila folder on the table between them. He had put his cap on top of it, brim up, and had left his hand resting on the cap for a long moment before he had lifted it away. "Meredith, there is a reason your grandfather Bertram drove out to my house in 2009. I know there is. I need to tell you what the reason was. Because if I do not tell you before that hearing in September and Vale's lawyer succeeds in what he is trying to do, I will not forgive myself for the rest of my life." She had poured his coffee. She had sat down across from him. She had not said anything. He had opened the folder. Inside had been a letter, yellowed at the edges, handwritten on lined paper, dated the 7th of July, 2009, addressed simply at the top to Ansel Broughton, signed at the bottom in the careful pencil script Meredith had come to know as well as her own handwriting, Bertram J. Thorvald. Ansel had turned the letter so it faced her. He had said quietly, "Read it." She had read it. Her grandfather had written it 3 months before he had passed. She had known that immediately because she had known when her grandfather had died. She had been 11. It had been October of that same year. The letter had been written when Bertram had already known, though the doctors had not yet formally told him that he did not have much time left. The letter was 2 pages long. It began in the way her grandfather had begun most of his written correspondence, with weather. Then it moved to bees. Then it moved to what her grandfather had come to understand over the previous decade about a man named Garrison Vale. Bertram had written that Vale had come to see him twice in 1998 and again in 2003 with 2 different offers to purchase 40 acres of Thorvald land at the northern edge of Vale's property. Bertram had declined both times. Vale had, after the second declining, told her grandfather that eventually the ground would come to him one way or another because ground always came to the man who was patient enough to wait for it. Bertram had written that he had not thought much of that comment at the time. He had written that he had begun in the years afterward to think more of it. He had written that he had watched Vale's operation quietly for the next several years. He had noticed that Vale's spraying schedules had, in the summer of 2009, coincided with a wind pattern that would have carried applications directly toward Ansel Broughton's apiary 15 miles to the west. He had noticed that Vale had, the year before, purchased a specific class of systemic neurotoxic pesticide that Bertram had out of his own concern for what industrial farming was becoming kept himself informed about. He had noticed, most importantly, that Vale had made 2 purchase inquiries about Ansel's own orchard property in the 18 months prior to Ansel's bee losses, and that Ansel had in both cases declined to sell. Bertram had written that he could not prove Vale had done it deliberately. He had written that he did not need to prove it to know it. He had written that he was leaving the letter with Ansel and a copy of the same letter with his son Harlan, and that if either of them ever needed the letter in a court of law or in a public hearing or in any circumstance where a man like Vale came for something they owned, they should present the letter and let the record show what one old apple farmer had come to understand about his neighbor before he died. Meredith had finished reading. She had put the letter down on the kitchen table. She had not been able to speak for a long moment. Ansel had watched her carefully. "Meredith, there is a second copy of this letter. With my father. With your father. Bertram gave it to Harlan the same week he gave me this one. I have not asked your father what he did with it. I have assumed all these years that Harlan kept it somewhere on the farm." Meredith had understood in that moment exactly where the second copy was. She had stood up. She had walked into her grandmother's writing room. She had opened the drawer of the old writing desk, and she had taken out the sealed envelope with her grandfather's initials pressed into red wax, and the 6 words written in careful pencil and underlined in her father's blue pen. She had carried it back to the kitchen. She had set it on the table beside Ansel's copy of the letter. She had said, very quietly, "I have been waiting to open this until I knew what I was doing." Ansel had looked at the wax seal. He had looked at the ink. He had looked at Meredith. "Meredith, you know what you are doing." She had broken the seal. Inside had been the second copy of the letter in her grandfather's same careful pencil, and beneath it a second sheet of paper her grandfather had not given to Ansel. A single page dated the 9th of July, 2009, addressed to Harlan Thorvald. Her father's copy had contained an additional page. The additional page had been a private note from a father to a son. Harlan, her grandfather, had written, "If ever a Thorvald grandchild inherits this farm, and if ever Garrison Vale appears at her door with an offer, give her this letter. Do not give it to her before she has begun the work. Give it to her when she has already chosen. She will need to know then that she is not alone in what she is about to do. Your father, Bertram." Meredith had read the note 3 times. She had folded it slowly. She had set it beside the letters. She had understood, sitting there in the quiet of her farmhouse kitchen with her hands resting on paper. Her grandfather had written the summer he was dying that she was not the first Thorvald to face Garrison Vale. She was only the first one who had been given a choice about how to face him. She had looked up at Ansel. "We are going to that hearing." "We are, and we are going to bring everything." "Yes, Meredith, we are." She had stood up from the table. She had gone to the phone. She had called Talia Renard at the bank. "Talia, it's Meredith Thorvald. I need the name of an agricultural attorney, the best one you know." Talia had been quiet on the line for a moment. Then she had said, "I know exactly who to call. Give me an hour." The agricultural attorney's name was Odessa Framingham, and she was 58 years old, based out of Montpelier, and had spent 31 years representing small Vermont farms in disputes with larger operations. She had driven out to the Thorvald farmhouse 2 days after Meredith called her. She had sat at the kitchen table for 4 hours, reading her grandfather's letters, Ansel's records of his colony losses in 2009, the state agricultural department's rejection of Ansel's original complaint, the veterinarian's report on Judah's puncture wound, and the photographs Meredith had taken of the cut section of fence along the Vale boundary. She had closed the folder at the end of those 4 hours. She had taken her glasses off. She had said, "Meredith, I'm going to be honest with you about 2 things. The first is that we are not going to win the case Vale has filed against you, not because we are wrong, because the case is procedural. He is not asking a court to say your bees are illegal. He is asking a court to require you to remove them. That is a nuisance action. The bar for it is very low. We will lose the ability to keep hives at their current density on your south fence line. We may lose the ability to keep any hives within a certain distance of the Vale boundary. That is the shape of what we are going to lose. And the second thing is that we are going to use his own lawsuit to expose him, because Vale filed a civil action, which means Vale is now subject to discovery, which means we can request his spraying records, his purchase records, and his internal communications going back further than his attorney would ever have allowed him to volunteer. And your grandfather's letters give me exactly the reason a judge will grant that discovery. Vale did not know when he filed the suit that a dying apple farmer had written down what he suspected about him in 2009. He does not know that your grandfather's letters exist. He is about to find out." Meredith had sat with that for a long moment. "So we are going to lose the hearing. We are going to lose the immediate remedy, and we are going to win something much larger." "What?" "His reputation, Meredith, in this county, in this state, among every farmer and every regulator and every bank officer who has ever done business with him. Because once the discovery goes on the public record of a civil action, everything comes into daylight. Everything." Meredith had thought about that. She had thought about Ansel Broughton losing 34 hives in 6 weeks in 2009. She had thought about Emmett Wexley being pressured into selling 20 acres 5 years ago. She had thought about a nail in Judah's hoof and a cut section of fence and a smile in her own kitchen in March. She had said, "Do it." Odessa had filed the discovery motion the following Monday. Vale's attorney had opposed it in every way procedural rules allowed. Odessa had prevailed in stages over the next 4 weeks. By the middle of August, the state court had granted a full production order. Vale's spraying records for the 2009 growing season became part of the public court file. His internal communications became part of the public court file. His purchase records for a certain class of systemic neurotoxic pesticide, along with the exact quantities purchased in the 18 months prior to Ansel Broughton's colony losses, became part of the public court file. The Marsh Hollow County Herald had picked up the story on the 21st of August. By the 25th of August, 3 Vermont dailies had picked it up. By the 1st of September, a state agricultural inspector had opened a review of Vale Orchards' spraying practices for the current season. By the 5th, Ansel Broughton had received a phone call from a lawyer he had not spoken to in 14 years, telling him that a new complaint could now be filed with the state agricultural department based on evidence in the public court record, and that this time the complaint would be heard. By the 9th, two of Vale Orchard's largest wholesale buyers had suspended their contracts pending the outcome of the state review. The hearing on the original nuisance action against Meredith's bees had taken place on the third Tuesday of September as scheduled. Meredith had walked into the county courthouse that morning with Odessa Framingham on one side of her and Ansel Broughton on the other. Corbin had been at home watching the farm with Ridley and the horses. Colton had flown in from Oregon the night before. He had sat in the second row behind her in a dark coat that finally fit right, watching everything with the still, quiet attention of a brother who had spent 9 months learning how to be his sister's brother again. Garrison Vale had been at the plaintiff's table. He had not looked at Meredith when she came in. Emmett Wexley had been in the back row of the gallery, hat in his lap. Talia Rennard had been in the third row in her professional suit notebook open in her hands. The hearing had lasted less than 2 hours. Odessa had argued precisely that the density of hives on the Thorvald property was consistent with normal agricultural beekeeping practice in the state of Vermont. She had submitted expert testimony from a University of Vermont apiary specialist, entered into evidence Ansel Broughton's operational records, and shown the court that no formal state complaint had ever been filed against the current Thorvald hives from any neighboring landowner other than Vale Orchards. The judge had asked Vale's attorney a series of specific procedural questions. Vale's attorney had answered them. The judge had asked Odessa a series of specific procedural questions. Odessa had answered them. The judge had ruled from the bench. She had ordered that hives within 150 feet of the Vale boundary be relocated within 30 days. She had declined to require the removal of any hives beyond that setback. She had declined to award damages. She had noted for the record that the court had before it in a separate action a substantial body of evidence bearing on the operational practices of Vale Orchards, and that any further nuisance actions arising between these two properties would be reviewed with the full weight of that evidentiary record. The gavel had come down. The hearing had ended. Garrison Vale had stood up at the plaintiff's table. He had not spoken to his attorney. He had not spoken to anyone in the gallery. He had walked out of the courtroom with the particular quiet dignity of a man who had understood somewhere in the previous 2 hours that he had just lost far more than the case he had come to argue. Meredith had not watched him leave. She had turned around in her seat and she had looked at Colton in the second row. Her brother had reached across the wooden rail and he had taken her hand for a moment and he had squeezed it, and he had not said anything because he had not needed to. Odessa had gathered her papers. Ansel had put a hand on Meredith's shoulder as she stood up. They had walked out of the courtroom together. Outside on the courthouse steps in the September sun, Emmett Wexley had been waiting. He had taken his hat off when Meredith came out. "Meredith, Emmett, I would like to say something in front of your lawyer, in front of Ansel, in front of your brother, because I did not say it in that courtroom, and I should have said it in that courtroom, and I am going to say it now." He had turned so that he was facing Meredith directly. "In 2020, Garrison Vale came to my property with an offer to purchase 20 acres of my northern block. He offered me a price that was above appraised value. I was going through a difficult financial year. My wife had been in and out of the hospital. I signed the contract on his terms without consulting my son, and I have regretted it for 5 years. I did not know at the time that Vale had known certain things about my financial situation that were not public record. I did not know that he had gotten that information from a bank officer at Marsh Hollow Federal who has since been let go for what were called improper disclosures. I did not know any of it until this July when your lawyer's discovery motion opened certain records I had never before had the ability to see." He had paused. "I bought that 20 acres back last month. Odessa Framingham helped me structure the purchase. Vale did not want to sell. He had no choice given the circumstances. And I want you to know, Meredith, that I would not have been able to do that if you had not stood up first. I would still be watching my son grow up on a farm that had been diminished by a man I had trusted. And I owe you for that. I will owe you for that until I am under the same ground as your father." He had put his hat back on. He had held out his hand. Meredith had taken it. They had stood there a long moment on the courthouse steps in the mild September sun. The old apple grower and the accountant's daughter who had come home to save her father's orchard, and Odessa had watched them from a discreet distance, and Ansel had watched them from a discreet distance, and Colton had watched them from the top step with his hands in his pockets and something in his face that Meredith had not seen on him since he was a boy. The State Agricultural Review had concluded in November. The findings had been released publicly on the 14th. Vale orchards had been found in violation of application setback requirements in the 2009 season and in 3 subsequent seasons for which discovery records had been available. Fines had been substantial but not ruinous. What had been ruinous was the certification loss. Vale orchards had been suspended from the state's premium fruit program for a period of 3 growing seasons. 2 of Vale's largest wholesale contracts had terminated permanently. A third had been renegotiated at significantly lower prices. Garrison Vale had not spoken publicly about the findings. By the beginning of the following year, his operation had been listed for sale. Not the whole thing, sections of it. The northern acreage first. The blocks closest to Ansel Broughton's original orchard 15 years after Vale had quietly, and without anybody being able to prove it, ended Ansel's working life. Ansel had not tried to buy any of it. He had told Meredith one evening in October on the porch of the Thorvald farmhouse with the sun going down behind the ridge that he did not want land Vale had held for 15 years and that he was content in the 7th decade of his life to keep his bees on Thorvald ground for as long as she would have them. She had told him she would have him forever. He had believed her. The harvest of that first year had come in during the middle 2 weeks of October. It had been the best harvest the Thorvald orchard had seen in 12 years. Not a miraculous harvest, not the kind of crop that gets written up in agricultural magazines, but a good one. Cleaner fruit than the year before. Stronger fruit set on the older trees than anyone had predicted. Yields on the North Block that had quietly exceeded the projections in Meredith's original spreadsheet from February. The tractor had been used 6 times over the course of the harvest. 6 times in a season, when it would previously have been used 60. Judah had come back sound in early August. He had worked the harvest alongside Marlowe, pulling wagons through the rows, the same way his ancestors had pulled wagons through Thorvald ground in the 1950s and 60s. Whit had gone home to Emmett Wexley's pasture at the end of July sound and well-conditioned, and Emmett had told Meredith at the time that Whit could come back any spring she needed him. Colton had flown in from Oregon on the morning of the 4th of October, and he had stayed for the entire harvest. He had worked in the orchard every day. He had loaded apples into wagons. He had eaten supper at his father's kitchen table every night. He had spent long evenings on the porch with Meredith and Corbin, talking quietly about the year, about their father, about the way certain things had settled into place that Colton had not understood in March could ever settle into place. On the 7th of October, Corbin had filmed his short video. He had done it in the mist of an early morning from the edge of the fence line with his phone held at hip level and no particular plan for what he intended to do with the footage. Judah and Marlowe had walked slowly through the fog, pulling a wagon stacked with crated apples. Meredith had walked beside them with the leather lines in her hand. Ridley had trotted ahead through the mist. The old trees had glowed in the low morning light, and the fog had risen off the frost on the grass, and Corbin had filmed for about 90 seconds before he had lowered his phone and had simply watched. He had shown the video to his father that evening. Colton had watched it twice. He had said quietly, "Can I post this? Do you think Aunt Meredith would mind?" "I do not think Aunt Meredith would mind at all." Colton had posted the video the following morning on his own account with a caption that had said nothing more than that his sister had saved their father's orchard with horses, bees, chickens, a rescue dog, and a stubborn belief that the old ways still knew what they were doing. He had not thought much of it. By the 2nd day, the video had been shared by 7,000 accounts. By the 4th day, it had been picked up by 2 regional food publications and 1 national podcast on small farm agriculture. By the end of the 2nd week, cars had been pulling into the driveway of the Thorvald orchard on Saturday afternoons, in numbers Meredith had not seen since her father was still alive. Some had come for apples, some had come for honey, some had come because they had seen the horses in the video and had wanted in the middle of a life that had felt to them for years like it was moving too fast to stand at a fence line for an hour and watch 2 working draft horses pull a wagon through an orchard the old way. Meredith had put up a sign at the roadside stand. It had said in hand-painted white letters on a green plank, "Thorvald Orchard. Apples, eggs, honey, animals at work. Please respect the birds." Talia Rennert had come out to the farm the last week of October. She had come alone. She had parked in the driveway. She had come up onto the porch. Meredith had opened the door before she had knocked. They had stood on the porch together for a moment. Talia had said quietly, "Meredith, I am here on my own time. I want to say two things, and then I want to talk about your note if you are willing." "All right. The first thing is that I did not act soon enough on what you told me in March. When you called me and said Vale had made you an offer, I told you what he was doing, but I did not tell you everything I already suspected. I had suspected for years. I had not acted on it. I was afraid of what would happen to my job. That was a personal failure on my part, and I want you to know that I understand it now and that I have thought about it every week since." "Talia, the second thing is that our bank is prepared to restructure your equipment note on significantly more favorable terms, not because of the harvest, though the harvest matters. Because I am the loan officer of record for your file. Because Colton is co-signing, which changes what we can offer, and because Marsh Hollow Federal is quietly reassessing certain of its relationships with agricultural clients, and I have been given specific latitude by our new agricultural director to make sure your file in particular is handled correctly." Meredith had thanked her. She had invited her in for coffee. They had sat at the kitchen table for the better part of an hour. By the time Talia had left that afternoon, Meredith had signed a term sheet that had reduced her monthly note payment by nearly a third, extended the repayment schedule, and released the personal guarantee her father had originally provided. The Thorvald farm, for the first time in 9 years, had been financially stable. Colton had come out to the porch after Talia's car had gone down the drive. He had sat down beside his sister on the top step. He had not said anything for a long moment. Then he had said, "Meredith, I want to ask you something. I have been thinking about it for a while. I am not going to be upset if you say no. Ask me." "Corbin wants to come out every summer. Not just this summer, every summer, until he's old enough to decide on his own where he wants to be. He has not said it to me directly. He has said it to his mother twice and once to his cousin in Portland. I have not asked him about it because I did not want him to think I was pushing him. But I would like, if you are willing, for him to come out every summer through high school, and for us, his mother and me, to bring him for shorter visits at other times too. Because he is different when he is here, Meredith. He is better." She had not answered right away. She had reached over and taken her brother's hand. She had said quietly, "Colton, he is welcome here every summer. He is welcome here every weekend. He is welcome here for as many days as you and his mother can spare him. He is a Thorvald. This is Thorvald ground. He should know it as well as we did when we were his age." Colton had squeezed her hand. He had said more quietly, "Thank you." They had sat on the porch together a long time after that. The last of the leaves had been coming off the trees. Ridley had come up onto the porch and had lain down between them. Somewhere out in the far pasture, Judah and Marlowe had been standing side by side against the west fence, their long necks stretched over the top rail, watching the sun go down behind the ridge in the way horses watch a familiar horizon after a long day. Emmett Wexley had come by on the 29th of October. He had brought his son, a man in his early 40s, whom Meredith had not seen in nearly 20 years, and the two of them had walked the property with her quietly on a mild afternoon, with the last of the harvest crates stacked in the packing shed and the trees mostly bare and the ground already beginning to firm under the first light frosts. They had ended their walk at the oldest tree in the row her grandfather had planted in 1952. Emmett had stood beneath it for a long moment. He had said, "Your father would have liked this, Meredith." She had looked up into the bare branches. She had looked at the old gray trunk. She had looked at Emmett Wexley, 71 years old, who had told her in November of the previous year that she was buying herself a heartbreak, and who was standing beside her now on a mild Vermont afternoon with the light going long across the pasture. She had said, "So would my grandfather." Emmett had nodded. He had not spoken again for a while. Then he had said quietly, "I remember the day he planted this tree. I was 3 years old. My father brought me over. Bertram was still a young man. He had just come home from Korea. He was thinner than the man you would remember if you remembered him at all. He was standing here in this exact spot, and he said something to my father that day that my father repeated to me every year on his birthday for the rest of his life." "What did he say?" "He said, 'This tree is not for me. This tree is for whoever comes after me.' And my father said, 'That is a long way to think ahead, Bert.' And your grandfather said, 'You can only really farm ground by thinking that far ahead. Otherwise, you are just moving dirt.'" Meredith had not been able to answer for a moment. She had put her hand on the old trunk. She had thought of the letter in her grandmother's writing desk. She had thought of her grandfather Bertram sitting on Ansel Broughton's porch in the summer of 2009. She had thought of the sealed envelope her father had underlined in blue pen. She had thought of her father Harlan, gone now almost a full year, standing on this same porch he had stood on for 72 years of his life. She had thought of her grandfather's line. She had said it out loud softly to nobody who could hear her except the man beside her and the sun beside him and the old tree above them all. Let the animals do what machines rush through. Emmett had smiled very slightly. He had said, "That sounds like Bert." He and his son had left before sunset. Meredith had stood alone under the old tree for a while after they had gone. The winter had come early that year. The first hard snow had fallen on the 9th of November, 3 weeks earlier than average, and Meredith had spent most of that first snow moving the last of the honey inventory into the packing shed, closing up the summer sections of the chicken enclosures and settling the horses into the barn for the season. Ansel had come out to prepare the hives for winter. He had wrapped each one, checked stores, closed the entrances against mice, and had told Meredith at the end of the afternoon that the bees would come through the winter as strong as any bees he had ever kept. Corbin had gone home to Oregon on the 15th of November. He had left on a Saturday morning. Colton had come to pick him up. Meredith had driven both of them to the airport in Burlington. Corbin had, at the departure curb, hugged his aunt for a long time and had said without looking up at her that he would see her in June. Meredith had said she would be waiting. She had driven home alone. She had stopped at the sign at the roadside stand on the way in, and she had covered it with a plastic tarp for the winter, and she had walked up to the farmhouse in the low, late afternoon light. She had gone into her grandmother's writing room. She had taken out the small locked drawer at the bottom of the old writing desk, the one she had never opened in the year since she had come home. Her mother's key had been in the same box as the cedar notebook chest. Meredith had used it that afternoon. Inside had been a small stack of letters. Every one of them had been from her father, written to her over the last 3 years of his life, never sent. She had sat on the floor of her grandmother's writing room in the fading November light, and she had read them. Her father Harlan had written her 16 letters between the winter of 2022 and the September before his death. Some of them had been short, some of them had been long. All of them had been about the farm and about the possibility of her someday coming home to it, and about what he would have wanted her to know if he had ever found the courage to say any of it out loud. The last letter had been dated the 12th of September, 2 months before he had died. He had written that he had begun to believe he was not going to make it through the winter. He had written that he had begun to think about what would happen to the orchard after him. He had written that he had in his desk drawer a sealed envelope his own father had left him 15 years earlier, and that if she was ever brave enough to come home and try to save this place, he wanted her to know that she was not the first Thorvald who had held that envelope in her hands and not yet been ready to open it. He had written in the last paragraph of that last unsent letter that he had once, when he was 12 years old, watched his father Bertram plant an apple tree at the end of the row closest to the barn, and that his father had said something that afternoon that Harlan had never forgotten. "This tree is not for me. This tree is for whoever comes after me." Harlan had written that he understood now at 71 years old exactly what his father had meant. He had written that he hoped more than he had ever hoped for anything that Meredith would come home. Meredith had sat in her grandmother's writing room until well past dark, holding her father's last letter in her hands. She had not cried. She had not made any sound at all. She had folded the letter carefully. She had put it back in the drawer with the other 15. She had locked the drawer. She had put the key on the desk in plain view where she would be able to find it again whenever she needed it. She had gone out to the barn one last time before sleep. The snow had been falling in slow, steady flakes by then. The barn had smelled of hay and old wood and the quiet, clean smell of 2 draft horses at rest for the night. Judah had lifted his enormous gray head over his stall door when she came in. Marlowe had made a soft, low sound of welcome from the stall beside him. Ridley had walked at her heel the length of the barn aisle and had sat down beside her when she stopped at Judah's stall door. Meredith had put her hand on the gray horse's face. She had said out loud in the quiet of the barn, "We made it through the first year." Judah had leaned his head into her palm. Marlowe had lowered her long black neck and had, in the slow, patient way of a good working mare, watched her mistress from the next stall. Meredith had stood there for a while longer. Then she had gone back to the farmhouse through the falling snow in the last light of a November evening at the end of the first full year she had ever lived on the ground her grandfather had planted for whoever would come after him. somewhere in the drawer of her grandmother's writing desk, 16 letters from a father who had never quite known how to speak to his daughter while he was alive were resting now in the hands of the person he had written them for. Somewhere along the south fence line of the Thorvald orchard, 38 beehives were closed against the winter, tended by an old beekeeper who had 15 years earlier lost everything he owned and had. In this 1 year gotten back something that mattered more than anything he had lost. Somewhere over the ridge in an orchard 15 miles east, a man named Garrison Vale was preparing to spend the winter making phone calls to buyers who no longer took his calls, and to bankers who no longer trusted his signature, and to a state agricultural office that was no longer willing to look past what it had been shown. And somewhere in the far corner of the north block, at the end of the row, her grandfather had planted in 1952, an old apple tree stood bare against the falling snow, older than the barn. Beside it, older than the fences around it, older than 3 generations of Thorvald hands that had cared for it, and it stood there patiently, the way it had stood for 72 years, waiting for the next bloom and the next harvest, and the next Thorvald who would come home to work under it. Meredith Thorvald went inside her father's house. She turned the porch light off. She banked the fire in the kitchen stove. She checked one last time the ledger on the counter where she had begun in March of that year, keeping her own farm records in her own pencil script. She wrote at the bottom of the last page for the year one line. Year 1. Ground held, family kept, bees came through. She closed the ledger. She turned out the kitchen light. The snow kept falling. The horses breathed slow and warm in the barn. The old tree at the end of the row stood in the dark. And in the morning, Meredith Thorvald, 42 years old, 1 year an orchardist and 1 year a Thorvald returned, would rise before the sun and would go out to feed her animals and to walk her fences and to begin in the quiet way her grandfather had begun before her, the second year of a life she had 12 months earlier almost let go.